Empires don't die quietly. They crumble from the edges, and from the ruins, something new always rises. For 1,000 years, Constantinople's walls never broke. That was about to change. Forever. In Germany, a goldsmith pressed metal to paper and accidentally changed the world more than any army ever had. Ships sailing into the unknown, a great city falling. Ideas spreading faster than kings could stop them. Stand in 1450, Gothic cathedrals, feudal lords. The church ruling all. This world looks permanent. It has 50 years left. In Ottoman furnaces, bronze was being poured into a cannon 27 feet long. Its only target, Constantinople. This is 1450, that tiny purple dot, the Byzantine Empire. Surrounded on all sides by Ottoman green. Alone. Far to the west, Portuguese sailors were doing what no European had dared, sailing south into blank maps. Ottoman crescents. Renaissance paintings. Printing presses. Ships vanishing over horizons, all of it happening at once. For 1,000 years, art glorified God and made humans small. Now, suddenly, humans were the glory. The Hagia Sophia, greatest church in Christendom for 900 years. Ottoman cannons were now outside its walls. The 15th century. Part 2: The Fall of Empires. 1450 to 1500 CE. By 1450, the Byzantine Empire was just one city. One magnificent, isolated, doomed city. Even in its final years, Constantinople was breathtaking. Ancient walls, a glittering harbor. 11 centuries of glory. His name was Mehmed II. He was 21 years old, and he had dreamed of Constantinople since childhood. Over 100,000 Ottoman warriors assembled outside the walls. The Byzantine defenders? Perhaps 7,000. Orban the Hungarian built a cannon 27 feet long. Constantinople couldn't afford him, so Mehmed hired him instead. Moving the basilica cannon required 60 oxen and 400 men. The ground shook wherever it went. Emperor Constantine XI stood on his walls. 7,000 defenders, 100,000 attackers. He didn't retreat. He waited. 700 Genoese soldiers arrived under Giustiniani. Not nearly enough, but the best help the West would send. The Byzantines stretched a massive iron chain across the harbor. It had saved the city before. Not this time. April 6, 1453. The cannons fired. Dust rose like a curtain. Walls that stood 1,000 years began to crack. Day after day, Ottoman cannons hammered the Theodosian walls. Defenders patched the breaches by night, knowing morning would come. Every night, women and children carried stones to repair the walls. They knew it was hopeless. They did it anyway. Mehmed's masterstroke. He dragged 70 ships overland, over a hill into the harbor, bypassing the chain entirely. At dawn, defenders looked into the Golden Horn and saw 70 Ottoman warships. The last hope died that morning. Now the city faced attack from two sides. The garrison was split. The mathematics of doom were unavoidable. May 28th, the final night. Constantine attended the last Christian service ever held in the Hagia Sophia. They sang until dawn. Before sunrise on May 29th, the drums, then the horns, then 100,000 voices. The final assault had begun. The first waves were expendable troops, sent deliberately to exhaust the defenders. Mehmed had planned for exactly this. Second wave, professional Anatolian infantry. The walls were holding, but barely, and only because of one man. Then the Janissaries advanced, the finest soldiers in the Islamic world. Every defender knew what this meant. Giustiniani fell, struck by a crossbow bolt. His men carried him from the walls. In minutes, the defense collapsed. A small gate called the Kirkeporta had been left unlocked. Ottoman soldiers found it, poured through, and appeared behind the defenders. Constantine XI removed his imperial robes, drew his sword, said, "The city is fallen," and charged into the enemy. He was never seen again. For 3 hours, the last defenders fought street by street. Then the greatest city in Christendom fell silent. Ottoman flags rose above Constantinople's walls. The Roman Empire, in one form or another for 1,500 years, was over. Mehmed II rode into the city slowly, deliberately. He was 21 years old, the greatest conqueror of his age. Mehmed entered the Hagia Sophia, knelt, and prayed. Then declared it a mosque. 9 centuries of Christian worship ended that day. For 3 days, Ottoman soldiers looted the city. Ancient treasures, sacred relics, all disappeared. The population was enslaved, but Greek scholars fled west with manuscripts. Ancient knowledge carried to Italy on small boats, and the Renaissance accelerated. When news reached Europe, it hit like a physical blow. If Constantinople fell, what walls could ever be trusted again? Constantinople became Istanbul, capital of the Ottoman Empire. The city didn't die, it was reborn as a new kind of power. Mehmed II received the title Fatih, the conqueror. He spoke 6 languages. He was the dominant ruler of his age. Look at this map. The Ottoman Empire now stretched from the Danube to the Euphrates. Europe's worst fears had come true. Johann Gutenberg's idea was simple. Individual metal letters rearranged endlessly. He spent years failing. Then one day, he didn't. Each letter cast in metal. Set your type, print a page, reset the letters, print the next, endlessly, perfectly. Around 1455, Gutenberg printed his Bible. Scholars who examined it couldn't believe human hands had made it. The machine had won. Set the type, roll the ink, press the paper, lift. A perfect page every time. Hundreds of them, thousands. A monk spent 30 years copying a single Bible. Gutenberg's press produced one in weeks. Their life's work suddenly obsolete. By 1465, printing presses existed in Italy. By 1477, England. By 1480, all of Europe. No one could stop it. Before Gutenberg, a few million manuscripts in all of Europe. By 1500 to 20 million printed books in 50 years. Ideas that once traveled at the speed of a horse now spread across Europe in months. The world had gotten louder. For the first time, ordinary people could own a Bible, read it themselves, interpret it themselves. The church's monopoly cracked. Martin Luther called the press God's highest act of grace. Without Gutenberg, there is no Reformation, no modern world. Universities suddenly had books for their students. Knowledge that once belonged to the wealthy now belonged to anyone who could read. Every revolution that followed, religious, scientific, political, ran through the printing press. Gutenberg didn't know he'd done all that. Two branches of the royal family. Both had a claim to the English throne. Both were right. Wars always follow. King Henry VI was gentle, pious, and occasionally mad. England needed a warrior king. It got a saint. Chaos followed. Richard, Duke of York, made the calculation. That king has no right to rule, and I do. The blood feud began. The First Battle of St. Albans, 1455. Dukes died in Marketown streets. The Wars of the Roses had begun. Red rose for Lancaster. White rose for York. Family against family. England tearing itself apart for a crown. Towton, Barnet, Tewkesbury. England's old noble families were consumed, one by one until almost none remained. Battle of Towton, 1461, a snowstorm, 28,000 dead, the bloodiest day on English soil ever. Edward IV, tall, brilliant, ruthless, seized the throne. England had its warrior king. The peace lasted until he trusted the wrong man. The Earl of Warwick had made Edward king. When they quarreled, Warwick switched sides, and England changed kings in months. Edward returned, killed Warwick, had Henry VI murdered in the Tower. The war seemed over. It was not. Edward IV died at 40, leaving 2 young sons, a 12-year-old king. A court full of ambitious men, danger approaching. Their uncle Richard declared them illegitimate and had them locked in the Tower of London, for their own safety. The princes in the Tower vanished from history in 1483, whether they were murdered, and by whom, no one knows. Richard III ruled for 2 years. His reign ended on a field in Leicestershire, on a desperate cavalry charge. Henry Tudor landed in Wales with 5,000 men and a Lancastrian claim most people considered hopeless. He marched anyway. Bosworth Field, 1485. Richard had the larger army, but not the loyalty. His commanders switched sides during the battle. Richard III died in the charge, the last English king to die in battle. His crown was found in a thorn bush. Henry VII was cautious and patient. He married a Yorkist princess. The roses were united. The wars were over. For 780 years, Christian kingdoms had fought to reclaim Iberia. By 1450, one jewel remained: Granada. Ferdinand and Isabella married in 1469. Two kingdoms united. Their combined power had one target: Granada. The Catholic monarchs ruled as genuine partners, something almost unheard of in 15th century Europe. Together, they were unstoppable. 10 years of siege and skirmish. Town by town, fortress by fortress. The Emirate of Granada was slowly strangled. Spanish artillery spoke a language medieval walls couldn't answer. What swords failed to do in 780 years, guns did in a decade. By 1491, only the city of Granada remained. Ferdinand built an entire fort outside its walls, just to show he'd wait forever. The Alhambra, the most beautiful palace in Europe. 8 centuries of Islamic civilization, about to change hands. January 2, 1492. Boabdil handed the keys of the Alhambra to Ferdinand and Isabella. 780 years ended with a ceremony. Boabdil stopped on a hill to look back at Granada and wept. The pass is still called the Moor's Sigh. Ferdinand and Isabella entered the Alhambra under Christian banners. The Reconquista was complete. The darker work began immediately. Weeks later, all Jews in Spain must convert or leave within 4 months. 200,000 people expelled in a single decree. The Spanish Inquisition enforced Catholic purity through torture and burning. Victory had a very long shadow. Columbus had one idea: sail west to reach Asia. He was right about the direction, wrong about the continent and the way. Portugal said no. England said no. Spain said no. Twice. Columbus kept coming back. Most people thought his numbers were wrong. They were. In April 1492, Queen Isabella finally said yes. 3 ships, 90 men. And Columbus's unshakable confidence in an ocean crossing. The Niña, the Pinta, the Santa Maria Laters. 3 small ships for an enormous unknown ocean. The crew wept as Spain disappeared. August 3, 1492, the ships left Palos, Spain, and sailed into the Atlantic, into the blank part of the map. 5 weeks. No land. The crew approached mutiny. Columbus recorded shorter distances in his diary to hide how far they'd gone. October 12, 1492. 2 in the morning, a lookout screamed, "Tierra! Tierra!" The world had just changed. Columbus planted the Spanish flag in the Bahamas. Taino people watched from the tree line. 2 worlds met, and nothing was the same. Columbus was certain he'd reached Asia. He called the people Indians. He died still believing it. The name stuck for 500 years. He explored Cuba, Hispaniola, the Bahamas, searching for gold and spice. He found beauty. And he began planning colonies. Columbus returned to Spain as the most celebrated man in Europe. He brought parrots and 10 abducted indigenous people. 3 more voyages, more Caribbean coast. He never found Asia. He never found the promised riches. He died under house arrest. While Columbus argued with monarchs, Portugal had been working south down Africa's coast for 50 years, mapping blank maps. In 1488, Bartolomeu Dias rounded the southern tip of Africa. The king renamed it the Cape of Good Hope. The route was open. Vasco da Gama left Lisbon in July 1497 with 4 ships and a mission: reach India. Not the Caribbean, India itself. Scurvy, storms, no charts. 10 months of sailing into unknown waters, they kept going. May 1498, da Gama's ships anchored in Calicut, India, the first Europeans to arrive by sea. He loaded the hold with spices: pepper, cinnamon, ginger, cloves. In 15th century Europe, these weren't condiments. They were worth their weight in silver. Da Gama's cargo was worth 60 times the cost of the voyage. Portugal immediately understood what it had. 1494, Spain and Portugal divided the entire world between themselves. The peoples of Africa, Asia, and the Americas were not consulted. Lorenzo de' Medici ruled Florence as banker, poet, and patron. He didn't just pay for art, he understood it. He inspired it. Botticelli's Birth of Venus, 1485, a pagan goddess painted with devotion reserved for the Virgin Mary, beauty as a divine principle. Botticelli's Primavera. Human figures full of emotion and movement, as if they might step off the canvas and into the room. A young man named Leonardo arrived in Florence. His teacher Verrocchio saw his work and never painted again. Leonardo's Last Supper, 1495 to 1498. He painted not just the moment, but the individual, psychological reaction of each of the 12. Leonardo's notebooks, flying machines, solar power, anatomical studies. Never published. Almost none of it reached the world in his lifetime. Pope Sixtus IV built a chapel named for himself. He had no idea that one day Michelangelo would paint its ceiling. Brunelleschi's dome over Florence Cathedral, the largest since Rome's Pantheon. Everyone said it was impossible. It wasn't. In Moscow, Ivan III was doing what no Russian ruler before him had managed, unifying the fractured Russian lands into one state. Ivan married a niece of the last Byzantine emperor, adopted the double-headed eagle, and declared Moscow the Third Rome. Under Ivan III, Moscow's territory tripled. Novgorod fell, Tver fell. Russia was being born, and being born large. The Great Stand on the Ugra River, 1480. The Mongols and Ivan faced each other for weeks, then the Mongols withdrew. In silence, Ivan refused to pay the Mongol tribute. For 240 years, every Russian prince had paid. Ivan said no. Russia was free. Moscow as the Third Rome, successor to Constantinople, protector of Orthodox Christianity, heir to Rome itself. The idea never fully disappeared. Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, was larger than any city in Europe. Its markets, pyramids, and canals would astonish the Spanish. The Inca Empire stretched 4,000 miles along the Andes. Roads, relay runners, Machu Picchu. The Spanish were a generation away.